Welcome to this video in which I will talk about historical sword design. Earlier this year I had the opportunity to examine an original Viking Age sword at Moscow Museum in Denmark. This particular sword was badly corroded and part of the point is missing today. And because I want to get a replica of this particular sword, which I will order from bladesmith Desht-Thor, I want to provide him with some reference material, so I decided to make a geometric reconstruction of this particular weapon, using a method which has been suggested by renowned swordsmith Peter Jonsson from Sweden. When I was at the Swiss National Museum about a month ago examining yet more original swords from the medieval period, the curator Adrian Bashung asked me how to conduct a reconstruction like that, where to start, and how do I proceed making such a reconstruction using Peter Jonsson's method. So I decided to use the illustrations which I created for Desht-Thor to explain to you how I actually make a construction like that. I met Peter Jonsson at the Armory in Lübeck in 2012, and it was then that he introduced me to his hypothesis on historical sword design. Peter is not only a swordsmith of world renown, he also is a designer and an illustrator, a very talented one, by the way. So naturally, making swords and being a designer, he wondered whether swords in the medieval period were actually designed using a particular process, a particular method. In this period, numbers played a huge role in explaining the world. In medicine, there was this idea that the human body consisted of 4 basic liquids, and they had to be in a particular balance to each other for a human being to be healthy, and sickness was explained by these liquids being unbalanced. There also, of course, were the 4 elements which made up everything that surrounded people. And even music was defined by mathematics and based on numbers, and geometry was used to even build cathedrals. So it really isn't a far stretch to assume that the epitome of the Middle Ages, the sword, which is definitely laden with a lot of symbolism, was designed according to similar guidelines too. So Peter, who had examined hundreds of swords over the course of the past 2 decades, started to look for systems, for design systems that might have been the basis for creating these swords. And in 2016, he finally presented the results of his research, which were published in the exhibition catalogue, The Sword, Form and Thought. So I used this book as a reference, and Peter has defined 3 basic structures for reconstructing, or rather designing, medieval swords. And most of the swords from the early and high medieval period fall into his structure number 1. And so does the sword from Moscow Museum, which by the way was found in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in northern Germany. And that's the one that I used to reconstruct its former shape. So here you see the drawing which I made of the sword from Mecklenburg, from Neuburg. And it is a tracing of the original sword. So the original sword was placed on this piece of paper and I traced its outline and then completed that drawing later. So this is the scan of my original drawing. The way that you start to reconstruct or to design a sword is you start with a basic cross shape. So one line of the cross will be the blade and the hilt, and then of course the shorter line of that cross will be where the crossbar will be located. And both these lines, they meet exactly in the middle of the crossbar. So this is how you start. And then from here, the length of the handle will be defined by the line from the center of the crossbar, so the intersection of the two lines that form the cross, up to where the pommel ends. And this particular distance, this measurement, this is what will form the radius of the basic circle. And this is how it all begins. So as you can see, here's the basic circle. And this circle is based on the length from the center of the crossguard to the top of the pommel. So that's the radius. Yeah. The center of the circle, of course, is determined by the intersection of the two lines that form the basic cross. So all other measurements are deduced from this basic circle. As you can see, there are smaller circles here which use the radius of the basic circle as their diameter. And one of these circles is around the crossguard, or rather shares its center with the basic circle, with the greater basic circle. And if I draw an octagon into this smaller circle, then this gives me the length of the crossguard, as you can see. So this really fits in very, very nicely. If I make even smaller circles, like those four here, so which have a diameter which is a quarter of the radius of the basic circle, then I get the length of the handle and I get the height of the pommel. So the pommel height is exactly a quarter radius of the basic circle. Now, in turn, further circles will give me further measurements for the pommel. So the height is determined by this smaller circle here, as I've just said, but at the same time, the width of the pommel is determined by the diameter of this smaller circle here. Yeah? Remember, the size of this circle is deduced from the original large circle, and it delivers and gives us the length of the pommel here as well as its height. Now, what I want to find out next, and that's a little more complicated, is how can I design a proper shape for the pommel top? So which circle can I use to define this particular shape here? And this is where it became a little more difficult. So I was dividing the original circle into even smaller circles. So here's another one, and then there are these tiny ones here. And they gave me a point on the central axis. And if I used this point and the distance to the top of the pommel, I had a new radius. It's this blue line you can see here, the outer blue line, this one here. So this nicely fits in with the shape of the original pommel cap. As you can see, we can also use the basic circle and its measurements to determine overall sword length. So if we subdivide the basic circle into smaller circles, like we have done for designing the hilts before, using circles which use the radius of the basic circle as their diameter, then you can see that the complete sword appears to be made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 such circles. Now, part of the original point is lost. And as so many swords appear to adhere to that system, this is quite a neat way to reconstruct the original length of swords that have been broken over time and which only survive in fragments, or which have like part of their point lost over time. So using Peter Jonsson's method could also help us to better understand the surviving remains of swords. I'm wondering if we possibly are even able to reconstruct the blade width and the taper of the blade, so its overall shape, using that system too. So with this particular blade here, I gave it a try, and after some experimentation turned out that if I connect two corners of the central octagon, which I had designed earlier on to reconstruct the length of the crossguard, and I connect these corners here with corners of a square, which is deduced from yet another circle, which uses half the radius of the basic circle as its diameter, then the lines that run along the blade, along its edges, appear to nicely indicate the overall taper of this particular sword. And it seems to stop just about where the last but one circle ends, and just within the very last circle, that's where it seems that there is a curved shape to the blade, gently curving towards the final point. So this is what the sword might have looked like in its heyday. There might have been pattern welding running along the fuller. I wasn't able to tell whether the Neuburg sword actually sports pattern welding, but the Desht-Thor sword does, which is a sword of the same type, which is now kept in the State Museum in Schleswig in northern Germany. And a lot of the swords from Mikołajczyce feature pattern welding as well. So pattern welding, and then there are edges that are welded to the core, consisting of steel, and the way that the handle is wrapped here is a method that I have adapted from the swords found at Mikołajczyce. Those appear to have been covered with a leather strap that was wound around the handle. The original handle would have consisted of wood, and some swords appear to have then been wound with textile before finally they would be covered with a leather strap in this fashion. And because the straps overlap, it forms these ribs. So I assume that would make for a really nice ergonomic and safe grip when you handle a sword that is covered in that fashion. So this is what it may have looked like. I'm really looking forward to the replica and the work of Götz, and of course I will keep you informed and document and present the sword once it is finished.